People love him already. He's got the Rhode Island twang.
The long pass to Moore and a pin block from Martin.
Tune in to Cam's Corner.
He's going to make it here.
Draws the foul for another Rhode Island and one.
Podcast. Got his own podcast.
It's good off the backboard and in. On a break.
All right, we're back, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Cam's Corner, Season 3, Episode 31, Episode 99 overall. So one more away from that milestone of 100, but today joining me, a studio host for the New York Knicks telecast on MSG Networks, as well as the host of New York Emmy Award-winning MSG 150 that airs during Knicks and Rangers games, Bill Pidto. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me.
My pleasure. Maybe we can do this twice to get you 100.
Yeah, for sure. And
do a doubleheader will get you to 100 episodes, right?
Yeah, right before the postseason. That'd be awesome.
There you go.
Yeah, first things first, I wanted to reassure you that, I mean, you see by the sweatshirt, the Brunson jersey behind me, diehard Knicks fan since birth. Nothing new for me. Me and my dad bleed orange and blue, but wanted to know your takes.
How can you grow up in Rhode Island and be bleeding orange and blue? You got to explain that to me. How'd that happen?
That's a question you got to ask my dad. For me, I kind of just followed his footsteps with the New York teams, the Giants, the Knicks, the Yankees, hockey's the Bruins. Unfortunately, not the Rangers, but that's something you got to ask him. I kind of just followed it when I was a kid.
Oh, all right. Okay, we'll do that in episode
100. But yeah, just for us, excited for the upcoming postseason. Just wanted to get your general thoughts on how you're feeling on how the Knicks secured that 2 seed.
Well, anybody who says that you don't play to win, I have real issues with people say that the Knicks should have not tried as hard against the Bulls to get the 3rd seed to take on Indiana. That's just bad karma. That's not how it's done. We work with Wally Zerbiak, former pro player. Pro players play to win, period. End of story. And then let the chips fall where they may. So you got the 2 seed. Maybe you have a more of a challenging first-round series. I think the Sixers and the Heat both will pose significant challenges. I personally am more concerned about the Sixers if Embiid is healthy and you have Embiid and Maxey. Kelly Oubre's been really good. They have Tobias Harris, Nick Batum, Buddy Hield. Lowry, who just was a thorn in the Knicks' side last year with Miami, of course, is now in Philly. Rozier for the Heat is hurt and not playing tonight. So I would say right now, as we sit here, I'm more concerned about the Sixers than Miami. Either way, it's going to be a challenge. But the Heat are less concerning to me than the Sixers, even though the Heat always seem to turn it on this time of year. I'm nervous both ways, but really more nervous against Philly. Yeah,
the Knicks, I mean, the Heat seem more, I guess they turned it up more once the postseason comes around. We saw it last year, of course, in the second round. But, for yourself, as far as like your journey, like that's like I told you before we started, like the main reason why I talk to a lot of the guests on my podcast is to get a general feel of how they started in their career. And for me, being an aspiring sports broadcaster and a Knicks fan, definitely interested in how you got to where you are today. So for the general viewer, listener, whoever's watching, just tell them where you're from and, what the sports scene was like for you growing up.
So I would say for you, you're doing what I did, and that is to get as much experience as possible in college. I grew up initially in Manhattan. Knicks were a big thing, winning championships when I was a little boy. Clyde Frazier was an icon. Back when I was a little boy in New York, the Knicks were so popular that people like my mom, who was not a basketball fan, loved the Knicks, loved Clyde Frazier. We moved to the West Coast, Palo Alto, California, when I was 7. I always knew I wanted to get into this. I was always into sports like you with your father. My dad and I always watched sporting events together. I went to Cornell. My dad's advice was get the best education you can, and you can pick up your experience on the side. You don't really need to study this in the classroom, and he was right. And one of the things that was advantageous for me is that at Cornell, there are not a lot of people that want to be broadcasters. So there's a lot of ability to get practical experience on the student radio station. Carl Ravitch, who you probably know, and I actually were the first 2 sportscasters on the local news in Ithaca, New York. So when I graduated in 1987, I had a good sample of my work. And that's what I would stress to anybody who is listening to this or watching this. You have to have a sample of your work to present to someone that might hire you. And the more reps that you have, the better that representation of your work is going to be. So I got a weekend job in Binghamton. I was making $6 an hour. My rent was $120 a month. Carl actually joined me at the station after I was promoted to sports director. I was in Binghamton for a couple of years. I sent out so many tapes back then. There was no such thing as email, so I actually had to go to the post office and mail out my tapes. I was so persistent and a regular at the post office that they would always say, "So, Bill, where's the tape going today?" I got into Syracuse Channel 3, WSTM in 1989. I was there for 6 months. I was hired after that at something called the Mizlou Sports News Network, which was 24-hour sports news just ahead of its time. I say that now, you say no big deal. In 1990, that was a foreign concept. Who's going to watch sports news 24 hours a day? Unfortunately, we're just a little bit ahead of our time, and that went from launch to bankruptcy in less than a year. I then freelanced at ESPN on the Scholastic Sports America show, which was a high school show. I was actually off the air. They auditioned me for a spot on ESPN radio as an update anchor, which I bombed terribly. I ended up going to New England Cable News in Boston. One of the executives from that failed sports network that I mentioned hired me there to be a sportscaster at the New England Cable News channel, which is a regional news channel. I was one of the sports guys there. I was fortunate enough to somehow get another look at ESPN when they launched ESPN2. I actually auditioned against it. I auditioned against Ravage for a spot on SportsCenter, and they hired Ravage, which was just heartbreaking at the time. So I then got hired at ESPN2 for that launch in the fall of '93. I was there from '93 to '08, and I've been at MSG since 2009. So I've been around a little bit in between there. I've done a lot of work on NHL Network. I've showed up before MSG on SNY. I did Mad Dog Radio for a year. Did some talk radio with Bruce Murray. We were the 10-2 team before I went to MSG. So I've done a lot of different things, but have loved MSG. Been very fortunate to have pretty much steady work here since I graduated all the way back in 1987. Now, you got to remember, when I started, there was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as Twitter. When I was on ESPN in the 90s, you had to watch us to find out who won the game. Think about that. You had to watch SportsCenter in that era to find out who won the game. That's an alien concept, but that's how long I've been at this. So yeah, thankfully it's worked out very well. A lot of persistence, some roadblocks along the way for sure, but I love what I do, and I've been very lucky.
Yeah, we'll go through each and every job that you've been able to secure over the years, and we'll talk about Cornell as well. But I wanted to ask, now that you talk about it, do you think nowadays for somebody like me, I mean, so much with the new technology, it's so much easier to send out to people, like you were mentioning before we recorded. Back then, to make connections and to meet people and to kind of get a foot in the door, do you think it was more easier for you back then than it would have been in today's day, or do you think vice versa? It's way more easier now than it would be back then.
I would say there's more opportunity now to just do it on your own, but I don't know how everybody monetizes all of this. I mean, anybody could turn on a microphone and do something on YouTube or do a podcast. I don't know about the challenges of getting paid to do it. The barrier for entry now is much lower than it was, but at least during my era, during my time, if you got hired, you could make a living wage. In terms of easier or harder, it's brutal whenever you want to do this, whatever the era, because there are a lot more people that want to do it than there are jobs. And it always comes down to, how are you going to get the person at the place that you're trying to get hired? How are you going to get that person to look at your reel and look at your tape? That's the challenge. Because think about it. If you were doing the hiring, you're not going to look at 1,000 reels. You're going to look at the couple that someone may recommend to you. So the key is to get recommended and then have the person that looks at it like you. And then you got to survive in the job. So there's a lot of hurdles here. It's not like being a lawyer. You go to law school, you're a lawyer. You go to medical school, you're a doctor. There's no specific path in this. This is like show business.
Yeah, most definitely. It's like, for me, I mean, still in school and almost graduating in May, but everything's been like up and down, right? Like, I meet all these people here and there, and it's like, great. Like, they know who I am. They know my work. But at the end of the day, like, I don't get paid to do this. I don't get paid to do a lot of the things I've been doing, but it's always, at least my mindset, it's always a right step in the right direction. The more you do, the better. And I could see that from your career. You did the same thing starting at Cornell. I saw in an MSG interview that you studied psych, but like your dad mentioned to you, like just doing the reps and continue to do what you want to do. You don't have to necessarily study that.
Right. Just think about it. If you study communications or broadcasting and you're no good at broadcasting, what good is that?
Exactly.
You got to be good at this. And if you're not good at it, having a degree in it's not going to help you.
Yeah, exactly. And to piggyback off of that, talk about like a time at Cornell broadcasting games that was kind of like your aha moment, knowing that you could see yourself doing this for like the rest of your life.
Well, so I was kind of like, oh my goodness, I'm at Cornell. How am I going to do this? And all these guys at Syracuse get all these jobs. And the point is, again, it's your representation of your work. So I knew that when I got to Cornell that I wanted to maximize my experience to get practical experience. I helped out on the Cornell basketball games. I helped out on the Cornell football games. And again, the big thing for me, I was very lucky in the summer of '86, prior to my senior year. The city of Ithaca started a local news channel, local newscast. And they hired nothing but guys like myself, college kids, who were able to get experience. And once the school year started, I was able to be on every night at 6. And if I didn't have that experience, I don't know if I would have had the representative tape to get a first job. So that was really lucky for me.
Yeah, was it hard to decipher whether to do, look into play-by-play jobs, or was it more so like you knew you kind of wanted to be like the anchoring aspect of it?
That's really interesting because for me, I just wanted to try and get hired. And I thought at that time there are more opportunities to get a job at a local affiliate like I did at the CBS affiliate in Binghamton. I never really pursued the play-by-play avenue. And in retrospect, maybe it would have been a different career track, but I just went where the opportunities were. And it's not easy. I've been a studio guy my whole life. I actually got the chance to call a couple of Knick games this year, but I've never done it before. And to my point, and to what we're talking about, to get good at play-by-play, like you sound like you've done a lot of games, it's all about the reps. So I kind of wish along the way I would have had more opportunity to get some play-by-play reps, but it's a different track. Studio and play-by-play are two different things. There are very few people that are good at both. There are very few play-by-play guys that do studio and very few studio guys that do play-by-play.
Yeah, and someone I've talked to on the podcast too, and I've built a little bit of a relationship with is Drew Carter, the new voice of the Celtics. Once Mike Gorman's done calling his last game, of course, this past weekend, but he started. I mean, obviously, his dream and stardom at Syracuse was to do play-by-play, but I think what got him the position he is in with now with the Celtics is he's great. Like you talk about that aspect of being able to do both at such a high level and such a great, stature and the way he presents himself and everything that goes into it. So that's what I've been trying to do is try to do like both at that high level. I mean, for you, one of your first jobs, again, talking about in '93 was anchoring with ESPN. But before that in Binghamton, you mentioned that job just opened up and I saw like, for me, is that a potential landing spot? Is that something that I want to get into, even though I'm not doing play-by-play? Was that the kind of like the similar mindset that you were doing at that time?
I didn't worry about play-by-play, and it turns out that when you get one of these jobs, if you're lucky enough to get a studio job or a job with an affiliate, you may have the opportunity to play-by-play in the market. That's something. I wanted a full-time job. Calling minor league baseball or whatever it may have been, or at that time, it was not a full-time job. But getting hired by one of these stations, that's a full-time job.
Yeah. So talk about the build up to that gig with ESPN and what went into like the hiring process and things like that.
So I was at New England Cable News and I auditioned. Now the hard part was, okay, you got to convince the guy who brings people in, like how are we going to audition Pidto when he choked the radio interview, the radio audition. And when I tell you I choked the radio audition for the ESPN radio, I choked it. You had to be ready to do an update every 15 minutes. It's like your nightmare when your time comes around. I wasn't ready to do it. Now it was not on the air, but it was an audition. So somehow I had an agent who represented Keith Oberman at the time, and she was able to get me in for an audition. I've never been as nervous for that as I was. I mean, sweat pouring down my back. I mean, because, there's not a lot of opportunity even back in the 90s. If ESPN is going to pass on you, and I was making, not a lot of money in Boston, that's a big miss. And if you don't get hired by ESPN, they're probably not going to hire you there. So there was tremendous anxiety going into that. The audition obviously went pretty good, but they hired Ravitch for the slot. That was a heartbreaking scenario. But then, when they brought people in for ESPN2 in the August period of '93, I got hired then.
Yeah, and you talk about how back then, of course, there wasn't live updates on your phone, like of games and scores, and you had to really watch, and that's how you figured out who won the game and all the information behind it. How did it feel to be the face of that in the early stages of all these shows coming to the networks?
Well, so being on SportsCenter like I was in the 90s, that's a heyday of the network. You know, we had Keith Olbermann, Dan Patrick, Stu Scott, Rich Eisen, Charlie Steiner, Robin Roberts, Bob Lee. I was never like a starter there. I would say I was like the 8th or 9th man back in that era, but you got tremendous exposure. I did NHL Tonight on ESPN2 in the middle 90s, so that helped me get into the hockey arena. I hadn't done a lot of hockey, and that really helped me at MSG because the guy who hired me at MSG, Dan Ronayne, was a big hockey guy, and he remembered me from ESPN2 doing the NHL Tonight. So again, whatever opportunity you have, if I would have told you when I was growing up that I would have been a hockey person, I don't think anybody would have said that's going to work out. But it's turned out to be a really valuable aspect to my career to be able to host hockey studio shows. I've obviously done an MSG. I work a little bit at NHL Network. So again, do whatever opportunity comes your way. You never, maybe you get a chance to do volleyball, and volleyball becomes this big deal here in the next handful of years. Women's sports is exploding. Maybe you have an opportunity to do some women's play-by-play or something like that. So whatever comes your way, if you want to be on the air, my advice is to do it.
Yeah, you talk about the legendary sportscasters that were with you and anchors that were with you at that time. What was it like working alongside them and kind of following in their footsteps and learning from them as you went along?
Very intimidating, to be honest with you. You sit next to Keith Olbermann on a show, or Dan Patrick, which I didn't always do. I didn't do that regularly. Can be very, very, very scary because of who these guys were. And back in that era, there were so many people watching these shows. I was also on NFL Primetime in the middle 90s with Chris Berman. And at that time, that was the highest rated show on sports cable TV, because at 7 o'clock on a Sunday, you had to watch that show to find out not who won the game, but to see the highlights. There was no red zone. There was no internet. Again, there was no Twitter. So that was a huge experience. And really, I've tried Chris Berman's my favorite, and I love the way he did things. So sitting next to him for a couple of years really was beneficial in developing my own style.
If you had to pick one memory that sticks out to you the most during that time, I'm sure there's a ton of them, but what would you pick?
Well, let's see. Just being in that mix, I would say being on the Berman show for a couple of years was the highlight in terms of audience. I mean, we had so many people watching that show. He would always give me the crummy matchups. So a Pidto game would be like the two worst teams. So that's I would only get 3 highlights a show, and they always were the worst games. But that was a great experience. Being part of ESPN2 when it launched was a great experience. Being a regular in the SportsCenter rotation in the late 90s was a great experience. So it was all things I'll never forget.
Yeah, and you were there for a number of years, and again, back to 2009 when you first started with MSG. Of course, the decision-making behind that, you can't turn out an opportunity like that, but what was that hiring process like now, come a few years after?
So I actually didn't have my contract renewed in 2008. So thankfully, MSG, I did a year on Mad Dog Radio on Sirius XM, and then thankfully MSG hired me for the 2009-10 season. And being a native New Yorker, these are my teams. They've always been my teams. In fact, when I was doing the hockey on ESPN, I'd always sneak away to watch the Knicks playoff games in the middle 90s. So I'm really fortunate. I worked with Mike Breen and Sam Rosen, and the guys are in the Hall of Fame. Clyde Frazier, our studio crew at the Knicks, Wally and Alan Monica on the Rangers, John Giannone, Steve Alakette, Henrik Lundqvist. It's just being a native New Yorker, being into these teams, and working with these Hall of Famers is just so grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, talk about your first day on the job, what that was like. Again, coming from New York, being able to finally now work in the greatest arena in all sports.
So I would say it was a big adjustment. MSG is much more ad lib. SportsCenter, much more scripted. So I had to get used to just rolling with an outline of what we're going to talk about and then kind of winging it. And that to be honest with you, it took a year or two to get the hang of it. And the MSG 150 with our great producer, Jeff Ostell, has really helped because of the creativity that he brings to it. And it's become a segment that people like to watch. So It's a different skill set when you're in one of these scenarios that's not as scripted. You know, the challenge even now is sitting down after a Knicks game and trying to process all that's happened and try to explain it in a condensed, concise manner right after the game ends. So that's always a challenge, and it keeps it fun on a nightly basis.
Yeah, and with the legends that you worked with at ESPN, working with probably two of the best in the business, and Mike Breen and Clyde Frazier, just talk about, again, working alongside of them, what that was like and how it's grown and how your relationship has built over these years.
So I open the Knicks games. I still sometimes can't believe that I'm opening the Knicks games and throwing to Mike and Clyde. I mean, I'm like, okay, is this happening here?
Yeah.
And they're so approachable. They're both in the Hall of Fame. Clyde's the only person on the planet in the Hall of Fame as a player and a broadcaster. Mike, as you know, is in the Hall of Fame. Sam Rosen is in the Hall of Fame for the hockey. Joe Micheletti's had a national career. I mean, and the thing about these guys, Cam, is that they're approachable. They don't think they're more important in the game. They have no ego. They're just such a thrill to be around. And I can't emphasize that enough. Clyde Frazier is the most down-to-earth, approachable guy in the world. So it's unbelievable. You know, that's what makes him great. Yeah, they're great at what they do, but they're just approachable, down-to-earth human beings too.
Any Knick game I've ever been to, I've always seen Clyde. I mean, he's always got like the sharp dress suits on, but he's always sitting down next to like a kid with like a microphone, or like he's always doing something with like the young fans and always interacting. And like you said, he's always so approachable. And Mike was somebody that I met one of my first times at MSG. He was walking back up right behind the basket, and my dad's like, "Oh, there's Mike Breen. Go say hi. Go say what's up." And this was like the first year of me getting into broadcasting. So that interaction with Mike and, looking up to him as far as always watching Knick games with my dad when I was a kid, like seeing that and then being able to meet him in person. I can only imagine, like you said, what it was like for you on those first few days on scene with them.
Well, I still get a little bit of goosebumps, like welcome to Knicks basketball. I'm Bill Pidto. Here are Mike and Clyde. Okay.
Yeah, it's super surreal. That's what drives me to do what I do now and try to get to that point at some point in my career. But I'm not too sure about how the Rangers have done over the years. I know you do Knicks and Rangers, but for someone like me, one of my close friends, Ryan DiLorenzo, is a huge Rangers fan, so he gives me the inside scoop on how they're doing each year and things like that. But so for a team like the Knicks, I guess, that have been bad for a number of years, what's it like covering a team that doesn't have much success?
Can be a challenge because we're going to try to emphasize the positive. Tom Thibodeau has been fantastic these last 4 years compared to the first 11 I was at the network, not even close.
Right.
12-13, they won the 54 games under Woodson, but other than that, D'Antoni won a playoff series. But now the Knicks have to be considered contenders, so obviously it changes the whole tone of the job. The challenge is to go on there when they're not winning and try to not be morose about it. So it makes it a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable for everybody when they're winning.
Yeah, is this one of like the seasons that sticks out to you the most as far as like success and on the Knicks aspect?
Yeah, well, they won 50 games. Now last year they won 47 games.
Right.
They won a playoff series last year. They did not do well the year after COVID. They didn't make the playoffs, but the year before that, during COVID, remember they played the Hawks in the first round and lost. So for Tibbs, it's been an excellent 4-year run overall, and hopefully this year they can win a couple of playoff series. The challenge is going to be, can they beat Miami or Philly in the first round? So that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And for yourself, when we look back at it, your career as a whole, when you look back at all the numbers of years you've been in the business, have you ever had a starstruck moment after meeting a player or like a fellow broadcaster? We talked about all the legends that you worked with, but any specific moment that like sticks out to you?
So I always had a thing for Bill Parcells. I don't know why. When I was in Binghamton, I went up to Albany to cover Giants camp, and he just torched me. He just mocked me and made fun of me, and he made it just played me for the impact of making everybody laugh. Like, here's this young reporter, and so when he came into ESPN, he used to be an analyst there. I was like, oh my goodness, there's Bill Parcells. The thing about ESPN is there's all these famous coaches and ex-jocks walking around all the time. And one of my first days also, Brent Musburger was in the building. And I'm like, man, there's Brent Musburger. So Yeah, it was always the one thing though at ESPN is it doesn't help to be like awestruck because you got to do the job. So I think when I was younger there, I got too caught up in all of this. But I would say the two people that kind of shook me a little bit was when I met Bill Parcells and when I saw Brent Musburger walking down the hall.
Has anybody came up to you in a sense like that, where they look at you as that figure?
And when I'm on the train, people like bow down. No, I don't. Sometimes people are nice enough to say hello, but I don't think that I haven't reached a level of a Bill Parcells or Brent Musburger. I don't think.
Or for someone like me, you definitely have that has been watching the Knicks and for a number of years and trying to get into the business. Obviously, still in school, but trying to make as many connections as possible and reach as many broadcasters that have been doing it for a number of years and perfected their craft for a number of years. So when you talk to people like me and people of college students per se, what would be your message to the youth and people like that as far as chasing that goal of being a
So I would with you. It's great to network with us, those of us who are on the air. But remember, we can't hire you. All we can do is give you feedback and maybe some advice. You need to try to network with the people that do the hiring, producers, executives. That's what's most important.
Most definitely. And coming on in the last few seconds, I mean, we talked about everything in your career, Bill. I just want to thank you so much again for hopping on Cam's Corner. The $1 million question I ask everybody at the end of the interview: what'd you think of Cam's Corner?
Cam's Corner. I'm glad to be in Cam's Corner. Never put Cam in the corner, but if you're on Cam's Corner, it's wonderful. How's that?
Yeah. So the thing was, you got to put me, when I was on the court playing in high school, you got to put me in the corner. That's my sweet spot.
Were you a good high school player?
I don't want to toot my own horn, but a little bit. I mean, I was a catch and shoot kind of guy, like pump fake, one dribble. That was my game on offense. But
Good.
like I told you,
college, did you play? You didn't play at URI at all, right?
No. Intramurals was the highest of my peak at the college level. But
all right, good.
Yeah, I told you, Dan Mazzulla, Joe's dad, was my coach throughout middle school and high school. So learned a lot from him. Take those lessons that he taught me then and brought it into sports broadcasting as far as discipline, hard work, always being consistent. So hopefully I'm doing a good job at that. Hopefully I'm making him proud and everybody that I've been able to meet and talk to like yourself.
Well, you sound great. It's a pleasure to be on with you. And if you want to do it again, let me know. You have my contact information. You want to send me a tape, send me a reel. Not a tape anymore. Send me a link to check you out. I'd love to check you out.
Yeah, thanks again, Bill. Episode 99, one more away from 100. We'll see you guys in the next episode of Cam's Corner.
On a break.